Namaste and good evening, everyone. Today we will continue part 20 on the current affairs and on the world situation, exploring the desperate moves by the cabal. And as usually, you may send your questions at our email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com, or you may post your question during the conversation in the chat box. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste and welcome to all of you. The intention was that today we would make the last of this series on current affairs, but for various reasons I am going to postpone that to the next one. And today I want to touch upon something which will, so to say, summarize all that we have been describing in terms of the nature of the current crisis and the imminence. I've been saying from the beginning, one of the reasons for this series on current affairs and to enter the domain of politics generally was because this year is going to be the most important in many ways. What happens now will determine what happens for the next 5 years. And in a sense, what happens in the next 5 years may determine what happens for the next 100 years. So this is a very crucial period, and we are already in the February month. February, as you know, being the month of the mother's birthday, many important shifts take place. Many revolutions have taken, sometimes even around the date of her birthday, as also August 15th being one of those turning points. You can see that in the dates of the Second World War as well as in recent events, Bangladesh getting its freedom, the Ukraine war starting, centered around February, August 15th being many other events, including events in the Second World War, and incidentally also a significant shift just before the what was called Operation Desert Storm, which all took place around this time, etc. Not that the date triggers it, rather it's a time of serious concentration of certain forces which also tend to trigger radical shifts, both positive as well as the reaction to those shifts, which is then seen as a negative. In any case, all that is just to set a broad background. Over the last 19 episodes of this theme of current affairs, this is the 20th, we have covered quite a few things, and if I had to go back and summarize some of the key ideas that we had put forward, that we are at a point of transition. This was the first episode, and the mother's message of the crisis before us, truth or the abyss, and her message to wake up and collaborate, by which that crisis can be averted. The second episode was, we had titled The Wall. I took the example that of Llewellyn's vision of the wall that separates from the world of light and the present, and he saw it was constructed by human beings. And what does that mean? And we entered into that, how that works, how there are these influences working across centuries sometimes, and not always human beings are conscious of the larger framework of their action, which build towards structures in which human beings are bound or using human beings to prevent the evolutionary change, to cloud, confuse, misdirect, or actively block. The third episode was the power, where he spoke of particularly the forces behind which act and structures which took place in the rise of the Nazi ideology and the post-war trends of rebuilding of banks, multinationals, globalist agendas, etc., and how the powers hid inside intelligence agencies. And we saw one of the very important ideas was how the Nazi energy went inside the US and became the core of the CIA, what emerged as the CIA. And there are many layers within these, so it's not always visible on the surface. We looked at the occult dimension behind this, which was in the episode number 4, and we drew upon various examples of people who were part of that, and influences on human beings through human trafficking and asuric methods. I don't want to elaborate, it's not so nice. And after that, episode 5, we looked at the disruptors. Because necessarily, if there is a build-up of something negative over time, there is equally the organization of the light, which is the prime driver of evolution always. And this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes in his writings as well as in Savitri. If not for the fact that the spiritual presence is inherent in everything, every substance, every atom, and therefore every being eventually. If it was not for that, then the world would have gone to blazes long ago. But because that light is there, it is always the saving light, inevitably, despite anything. If you allow a long enough period of time, it pushes forward. Inexorably, inevitably. The question, of course, is we don't want to wait another million years. We don't want to have relapses 100 times. We want to be able to shorten that. So, if not for that, we would never have had hope. But because of that, the hope is certain. But also that there are active powers that intervene, spiritual powers equally, which are working through human instruments. And we looked at the disruptors. This was episode number 5. And I began with Elon Musk as one of the major disruptors. We went in some great detail. The next episode, Good Money, dwelt on this. And I also looked at how the infrastructure is being built, how the media uses various kinds of hypnotic triggers, and we have to be careful not to allow ourselves to be triggered by these names or what we are taught by the media. The next episode was Pushback, where I elaborated on other disruptors. And the main point I made was you don't have to like them. You can hate them all you want, doesn't matter. They're disrupting the globalist agenda. That's all that matters as far as our purpose is concerned. And the next episode 8 was Peacemakers. We looked at how some of these disruptors actively have been building peace all around the world. One of them, particularly Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. From that point where we had that episode to now, there is so much change taking place in Saudi Arabia. The extremist Islam has been completely wiped out. All the funding has been cut, and he's become an active force to reform even values in Saudi Arabia in the collective consciousness. They're looking at their own traditions going back into pre-Islamic periods and inviting people in a way that is quite remarkable. And also you see some of this happening in the UAE and so on in the Middle East. Episode number 9, we looked at false narratives and some of the questions which came up, which we took up in a kind of a direct form, giving a picture of how the media distorts and hides. Episode number 10 was Warmongers, where we looked at many aspects, including the place of politics in spiritual life, but I spoke also of some of the examples. I suggested certain sources which you might want to look at for getting news of a different kind. Episode 11 was about Israel, and we saw the place of the nation soul and the place of Israel, particularly in the larger context, going back more than 2,000, 3,000 years perhaps, and how it has actually been such a major, powerful influence even for Christianity and Islam, which largely have drawn from it. Even you could say 90% of it comes from the Jewish tradition. But we looked at the bigger picture also of how intelligence failures were involved. Some of them might have been deliberate in the Hamas attack and certain ramifications of that. In the next episode, which was 12th, we looked at the 100-year war framework and also many questions relating to that. And the 13th episode was regime change and colonizing minds, again a historical perspective across many spaces on earth and how this system works. I spoke of 4 large ideological groups, religious groups, as well as state ideologies, orchestrated events, and the mother on the new politics that is needed for India. We looked at color revolutions, etc. In the episode number 14, we looked at engineering revolutions and the template for engineering the revolutions. In particular, I drew upon one article that gave a very detailed analysis of how so many regime changes were organized in Europe, color revolutions and so on, all hard data. There's nothing of personal opinion there. And all you need to do is study these templates. We looked at all the lists where all the countries where all these regime changes, color revolutions, Arab Springs, etc., have taken place. All this drawing from official sources of the Cabal, including Wikipedia and articles, and the framework, especially of the and the toolkit for the regime change specialists, funding of the NGOs, using young student activists, catchy single syllables, creating martyrs, etc. And that is one of the things which you should review if you would like to understand what is currently happening within India, as well as in various other parts of the world, in the US in particular. And these two I'm going to focus upon today. After that, we looked at the theme. 15th episode was the war machine, and we particularly looked at the Ukraine war from various angles. The cabal interests primarily, which want just the whole world to be at war, arms manufacturers involved, career politicians, their interests, economic interests of oil, gas, nuclear power, water, food, cultural, linguistic, historical identities, and complex links between Russia and Ukraine. And for this, I would highly recommend for you an interview which Tucker Carlson has just released, directly talking to Putin, and I'll come back to this shortly. And then human trafficking. And after all that, we looked at the biolabs which had been set up, the militarization which had been taking place on the frontier of Russia, not just in Ukraine, but in all the other countries also, in which NATO had been expanding, and the larger picture of drivers for the war. And in the next episode, which was 16th, we'd just taken up questions, trying to catch up with quite a large pile of questions and many issues, particularly involving the issues of religions and so on. Number 17, I titled The New Dawn, a new dawn which was focusing primarily on a special event which took place 2 days after that episode, which was the establishment of the presence, Prana Pratishtha, establishing the spiritual life force in the Rama's idol on his birthplace, which is so significant. And if you see how things have shifted after that, in the climate and the mood of the country, but also in that space, the rapidity of changes, growth, etc. And I'm not just pointing to economic and political changes, but and though those are very significant, in many ways, I saw some statistics, just that Ayodhya will become, or already has become, the largest site of religious pilgrimage, dwarfing the Vatican or other religious sites that have been popularly known, just like that, literally overnight. And the importance of that in the symbolism of who Rama represents, the nature of the consciousness, and we saw Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary and the way he formulated things, which is so significant. And we looked at also his interview in 1907, where he describes the transition of the yugas and so on. And if you may recall also my article, which had been published in 1990, which looked at the year 2024 specifically as a major turning point. The next episode, which was the 18th, was on the environmental crisis. We kind of cut through the propaganda of carbon being a poison. It's not. It's the basis of life on Earth. And carbon dioxide is not a poison. And there is a problem of pollution, but carbon dioxide is not pollution. Pollution is all the rest that we are pumping into the environment, in the air, in the water, in the soil, which are destroying life, which are not part of the life cycle. And we went through a reasonably technical but accessible description of all the issues and complex perspectives, as well as how we are being lied to, and sometimes so blatantly that you have to wonder how much the cabal and deep state operatives would be laughing at our gullibility. And the way it is done when Bill Gates actually speaks of cutting trees and burying them to sequester carbon. And you have to ask yourself, I'm going to put it another way. Sometimes when I was a young student in the ashram school, we had teachers who should never have been teachers, perhaps, at least not for that age group. They might have been good for younger children, who would say things which were so outlandishly ridiculous or stupid or wrong that I had to convince myself that there must be something to it. that I am somehow not seeing the point they're trying to make, and I must be stupid enough not to understand, and I would spend time trying to figure out I couldn't believe someone could be that stupid or that wrong. And there must be something that I'm missing. And I spent a lot of time until finally I had to face the reality much later in adult life that that's it. They don't know. That's it. But this is unfortunately the tendency of human beings. When the whole media is hammering away at you, oh, there is this is true. Even though you can see that it's wrong, you question yourself and doubt and say, perhaps they are right. And you make the appropriate noises. And if 10 of us make the appropriate noises, we end up believing everyone else understands I am the only fool. Unfortunately, we are all in this pretense. So that was part of the theme and content there. I had left a lot of links, and I would highly recommend for you to look at those. Last time we looked at episode 19, which was Secret Space. And it dwells into an area which is, I won't say speculative, the evidence is very strong, but how much more has actually taken place is somewhat speculative. There are sources, there are people claiming things, but we have not much except certain technological evidence, which I will reserve for next time, and look at what's actually possible next time with those very basic accessible technologies, even technologies that you could put together in your garage, and how that could change our lives. Today, though, it will be a summary of what's currently happening, because from the point we started the series to today, so much has already happened, and I want to point to certain directions and trends which you will see perhaps greatly amplified over the next few months, with a certain desperation towards the end of this year when the US elections will take place. But already in the India elections you see certain signs of desperation. But it seems to me as if the India elections are largely sealed. The events here are so clear, and there is very little scope for mischief other than creating civil strife and doubt in people's minds, which also is being attempted to somehow stop Modi. But all they can do is reduce the number of seats or create enough divisions that later, after the elections, you could have some kind of civil strife, reactions, demonstrations to badmouth the government that comes to power. You already see this happening. Just with the Ram Temple, you had headlines by the BBC or the New York Times and others which presented it as an anti-Muslim move, which it was not at all. Or when you see the attempt to create a uniform civil code in Uttarakhand, one of the states of India, it is presented as an anti-Muslim move. No, it's not. But why are they presenting everything as anti-Muslim? When for a long time they demanded India should be secular, and the Uniform Civil Code is the most secular step because it unifies all across traditions, across religions to one common civil code of marriage, divorce, inheritance and tax. And that should be the most secular move. And the same people who were criticizing India for not being secular enough are now saying this is anti-Muslim and that Sharia law is better than the Uniform Civil Code. And this is, by the way, from the BBC. And you have to ask yourself, what is wrong with these people? But if you don't look at the big picture, you will actually think, oh, there must be something wrong with the Uniform Civil Code. I'm not saying it's perfect. I've not even bothered to look at the details. I've read some of the criticisms. I'm sure it can be improved. I'm sure it will be improved in time. It might be revised down a few weeks, a few months, after 10 years, after 100 years, as it should be. But to present it as an anti-Muslim move, you have to wonder, what is the intent there? And the intent is within India to create a disruption of the Muslim population by presenting it as being under threat and even convincing them that they're under threat based on false information, on the basis of which they can be triggered to react and to trigger demonstrations and the color regime change mechanisms, etc. So understand the toolkit, observe these things, if nothing else, to create a negative image in the West about India, about Modi, about the BJP, so that when the BJP comes to power, and that's an inevitable, it's only a question of numbers, it will be presented as a radical and negative step for India. And it will be used in various other ways. So again, I'm giving a summary of the trends based on what we have already discussed observe this, and you will be able to cut through the clutter that the media pushes. So as far as India is concerned, there is not too much to worry. The cabal is still making desperate moves, but there's not too much it can do. Its thinking is long term. In the sense, once the BJP comes to power, which will happen, what can it do to gradually foment unrest, build to some kind of civil unrest to degrees which are so high that you might even end up in partial overthrow of the government, or at least blacklisting India in the international eyes the way they have already done for certain countries on the basis of some false narratives. And so there are many approaches, and there are lots of, we will say, textbook templates that are being activated now, but with a longer term interest and strategy and plan. If nothing else, even to trigger war with various attempts through Pakistan or through China and so on. So this is as far as India is concerned. We are seeing things happen. Watch carefully. Don't get blinded by the propaganda. But the US elections is more complex, because the power center of the military which can overthrow the cabal is in the United States. The financial power, again, which can overthrow the cabal, is under control of the United States. In part, there's a London-based control, but still that is secondary control to the actual power center which is in the US. In particular also, and this connects to what we discussed last time, the secret space programs. So the group that was against the cabal has been building an infrastructure which includes some of the space-based infrastructure. One of the things that Trump did by creating Space Force was to bring some of that infrastructure within the framework of the government, but at a deeper level, at a classified level. And in order to be able to unify and activate some of these mechanisms as required to overthrow the cabal. And this is moving, let's say, in a very strategic direction. Part of the strategy included to allow a decline in the US after Trump's, let's say, removal from power in 2020, with Biden coming in place as the US president, and you can see what happened subsequently, the sliding of the economy, the massive invasion across the borders, the conflicts that started all over the world, including several new wars, etc. All the cabal policies, but put in an accelerated framework. It's as if they had to catch up for the 4 years loss under Trump. And in that acceleration was the exposure to the public. People are waking up. COVID was a major wake up, but subsequent to that, there are things happening at a pace that are too rapid to allow you to remain brainwashed. The frog which is being boiled is now being heated too quickly, and it suddenly feels the difference and starts questioning. And so this is happening, and it's important, and this is part of a necessary phase, without which there would not be sufficient collective support for a change. And without that support, you can make all the things you want, you would lapse back eventually. So the real problem, if you look at from the perspective of the forces of light and the forces that want to disrupt the globalist agenda, is still a change of human consciousness. We are not speaking of a spiritual change. We are just speaking of a change where people wake up and start questioning the media lies, the media deception, but also being exposed to facts which are very disturbing. So in a sense, what we have done in this part of the last 19 and this 20th episode on current affairs is to provide that in a miniature way, but primarily from a spiritual perspective. For those of us who come from a certain background, particularly of the writings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And I want to point out that whatever may be the things we have discussed, on my part, I have tried as far as possible to give a broad picture from the spiritual perspective with relevant facts, details, and not tried to make a bulletproof documentary. I have neither the time nor the capacity to do that. When certain things, and so I'm open to having made mistakes, slips on various points. Wherever possible, I've provided evidence of links, especially in the second half. The first half, it did not strike me that we could have done that. Nevertheless, I have also made some slips while speaking, because sometimes I'm drawing on things I've read over the last few years, sometimes things I've read over the last 30 years. And unfortunately, with age and with some disruption of sleep, one tends to get a little blurry on specifics of details. So I ask forgiveness for that, but that's not changing fundamentally the framework of what I've been presenting. And please understand, it's not meant to be a documentary. There are others who have done better jobs making documentaries. One such, if you are interested, and you may not agree with all of it, but it's a good work done, is The Fall of the Cabal. And that was removed from YouTube. I think it's a 10-part documentary. You will find it on Rumble. But my point in presenting all this was to give you a framework in which you can start thinking for yourself. You can understand why things are the way they are, but from a spiritual point of view. And then if you so choose, you can do further research and go deeper into it. Apply your mind to cut through the cabal, media agenda and manipulation. This was the primary objective. And this is so important for me because all of us are going to be facing, and it's important that we are all aligned to a higher truth in what happens in the next few months, in the next 1 year particularly. And we will all be exposed to a lot of confusing, clouding information. To be able to see through is important. And I hope, and as we have seen from much of the feedback that I have not put up here, many people have benefited immensely. But I'm pointing to something in the US elections, because that's going to still be the fulcrum, the point of transition in this overthrow of the cabal. If what happens in the next 1 year goes in the direction intended, then the overthrow of the cabal is inevitable, and the cabal knows it, because certain things were put in place, and successfully even. And it happened during Trump's time with the Space Force actually knocking out satellites which were owned by the cabal. And as I discussed also, things which happened in freeing up North Korea and changes in the Middle East, etc. Those were done so successfully that the cabal was as if surprised and pushed back hard to counter this. So one of the things which you see very powerful in the US elections media narrative is somehow, by some means, stop Trump from getting elected. And you see the desperation of this by a slew of court cases, and whatever the justification, not all of them are justified. We have touched on 1 or 2 examples, but just somehow bind him in a way that he cannot even stand for elections, for which certain judgments have been passed by politically aligned judges, which are constitutionally wrong, and yet they have been passed blatantly. And it just shows you the desperation involved. Or, if that can't be done, there's the second backup plan, which is somehow to force people to vote by postal ballots, which did happen last time in 2020, and there was a lot which took place, which I will just say here. I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to get back all the links, but over the years I've been saving videos, links on my emails, on my laptop, on my mobile. But there's so much material for me to go back and put together. It would take me a few days just to prepare for this session, and I just don't have the time currently, unfortunately. And as I said, there are others who have done better jobs. So I'm just going to summarize certain key elements of this. What had happened last time, there were places which were what we call in elections, the phrase, this phrase, I'm missing the exact words. In elections, often there are swing states, but within swing states there are swing counties. And if you look at the numbers, often one county swinging this way or that could change the whole outcome. If you look at when George Bush was elected, it all came down to Pensacola and one county in which the counting of votes depended on the chads. So they were punching of the votes, and if the chad was fully pulled out or was left hanging, and a court judgment whether that counted as a yes or no, or was that a valid ballot or not. Can you imagine how ridiculously blatant and stupid that argument would be? That a chad cut from the hole, punched, still left hanging, is counted as an invalid ballot. Can you imagine how stupid that has to be as a judgment? And on the basis of that, the numbers were so small that swung the election finally to George Bush. You have to understand how serious that is. And that incidentally was the city, the town, I think even the county where Sri Aurobindo's relics are installed in the United States, the first place where Sri Aurobindo's relics were installed in Pensacola. So I did not see in that a coincidence. I saw in that a very clear symbolic representation of the nature of the struggle of the spiritual forces against the dark. But at that point, unfortunately, it swung. Actually, to go back, it didn't matter who won because both represented cabal interests. It would have gone this way or that, they would have done exactly the same thing. So it was not so crucial. But as we see the disruptors, with the disruptors, it is crucial. So if you can tilt somehow the ballots in some of these swing counties, not even states, you can make a huge difference. And we saw that in 2020. There's a documentary made of it which was taken down in YouTube. You'll find it on Rumble. It's called 2000 Mules. What they did was they analyzed the telephone signals from people who were going in a certain area. They found 2000 people who were going into these postal ballot boxes. And they were going from ballot box to ballot box, stuffing ballot boxes. Now this is one of the weird things in the United States, that you can actually go and buy, if you want to buy alcohol, you have to show proof of age. If you want to go to various kinds of basic activities, take a driving license, basic things, enroll in certain activities, into clubs, you have to show proof of age. But if you want to vote, you don't need to show identity proof or proof of age. And that is something so unbelievable, so surprising, so shocking. It's worse than a banana republic. How at all this has been allowed to stay on, despite people speaking up about it. You have to understand, because always the cabal controlled both sides. It didn't care. There was uniparty. It didn't matter who won. They all did exactly the same thing. Obama came to power. He did exactly what George Bush was doing, sent more troops into the Middle East, except that the media was muted. They were busy distracting you with other statements. When Trump came, that thing changed for the first time because he was a disruptor. He did not follow cabal policies. He did things contrary to cabal. And so there it mattered. But what the documentary shows is these people used the fact that it did not matter, and the people in certain counties were allowed to vote by postal ballots. Signatures did not need to tally. There were court cases around that which are still hanging. The signatures were not verified, and because of that there was a swing. Another example which happened in many of the swing counties, the counting was stopped for 3 hours. During that time, trucks came with ballot papers which had been stamped, and when those ballot papers were put up and counted, surprisingly, suddenly the number of votes for Biden shot up. So you had this graph which went like this. Trump was higher, Biden was lower. There's a point where it stops, and then 3 hours is closed. The trucks come, and suddenly Biden goes up and wins. And all these videos of those trucks which come from the cameras, etc., all those I had actually saved. It's not my intent to prove it, but and I saw how these were removed later from the internet, from Twitter, etc. Fortunately now under Elon Musk, a lot of these things are coming back. But it's just to show you that things were done. And in India we're used to this because we have seen this going back 70 years. And unfortunately for the cabal, when the BJP came to power, they started changing this and brought forward the electronic voting machines with protocols by which it could not be tampered. And to this day, nobody can give you evidence of how that they can be tampered. But and the US is still way behind. It's so primitive in the election scenario that literally anybody can vote. And I know people who are not US citizens living in the US who have gone and voted. And they say it openly, we just did it because we believed in this candidate. That you can do that is still shocking for something which is so critical. But it's as if the cabal wants to leave that open so that now you can have a large number of illegal immigrants coming in who will then vote obviously in the direction that serves their interest. So we'll come to that shortly though. So there has been a lot of evidence of ballot stuffing, both human as well as electronic. There was an analysis of some of the machines used for voting, and they found in the software that it was set to switch votes every now and then from one candidate to another in a kind of a staggered way. And the data of and they were all connected to the internet. The data was being stored on servers in Germany, and there were internet links coming from Italy to those machines. It was amazing. And all this was documented evidence by the US government. But mainstream media completely covered it up. This is just to show you the scope and what is at stake and the desperation involved. You see, so this is US elections. I'm going to come to certain aspects of it later. You see also something quite amazing recently, how the court went against Elon Musk. He had an agreement with his company that based on certain performance that he produced, he would get a certain percentage. This was agreed by the board. His performance went so high. Actually, the share value went up 1,000-fold within 2 or 3 years. Imagine a person who's able to take share value 1,000-fold up. Naturally, what he had as due to him went up 1,000-fold up. So it came to some $35 billion. Not million, billion, a little more maybe. And this was taken by some metal music musician. So obviously someone who is in a satanic practice, who takes it to court, questions this. He has only 4 shares. He doesn't pay a penny. The whole thing is he's only a name who's signing on paper. And there's a whole company of lawyers, which is known to be anti-Trump and pro-cabal, which now takes care of the whole attack in the court. The judge, who is also fixed, orders that the $35 billion is not acceptable because the number is too high and it should be denied to Musk. Just think about it. At what point has anyone committed a crime? It's just the extraordinary performance of Elon Musk that would have given him that extraordinary amount, which was completely justified because all the shareholders gained 1,000-fold. So he also should gain proportionally based on the agreement. If they had gained 10-fold, he would have gained 10-fold, and that was acceptable. A week later, a similar thing was placed, I don't remember now, for one of the other companies, was it Apple or Microsoft, where also there was a shareholder questioning, and that was passed by the judge. They said it's okay. That's legal. But for Elon Musk, it's not legal. Why? Because the cabal wanted to ensure Musk does not get those $35 billion. He has caused them so much damage by buying up Twitter and by all the other things he has done, which we have discussed. They would not allow him to have more money. In fact, Bill Gates has bet $1 billion against Tesla stock, shorting it. That means, you understand how shorting works. You bet that the price of the shares will fall, and that bet he is willing to lose $1 billion to force the share prices to fall. And if it does not fall, he's going to lose $1 billion. Understand how desperate the cabal is to ensure that Elon Musk does not get funds. Why? Because he's been promoting free speech through Twitter or X. But not only that, through SpaceX, through the Starlink, through the Tesla cars, and through it all, the direction in which he has been moving, which if you see the ramifications which we have discussed before, it means there will be a scope where the cabal will have no control over a large part of humanity. They have to stop it somehow. So that's just as an example of what's happening to stop Elon Musk. And you can see recently Elon Musk has started speaking up very openly about the border invasion in the US, As you know, there is about between 2 to 3 million people walking in across the border into the US. Many of these are criminals. Many of these are military trained from Middle East countries and countries which hate the United States. There is no background check. All these people are taken in. They are given money. They are given free food, free shelter, free finances. New York State is allowing these illegal immigrants to live in hotels and elite hotels, and the hotels are full, and the state is paying the hotels for them. Finally, the hotels became so full that there's no place for visitors, and there are still illegal immigrants coming in because they're being bused or flown by flight across the United States. And so they shut down a school to put 2,000 illegal immigrants to live there. And then, as an experiment, they are giving free credit cards with a large amount of credit to all the illegal immigrants. You have to ask yourself, who in their right mind, without background check, would allow an invasion? Because that's the correct word for this. It's not illegal immigrants, it's an invasion of the United States. Who in the right mind, and for what reason would they do it? Unless there was a reason so desperate that they don't mind sinking the US economy, they don't mind that American citizen would turn against them in order to stay in power. So what do they need? Even the US citizens could turn against them, but they would stay in power. How? Because with the illegal immigrants, they would put them in for the vote, or for the riots, or whatever it is that is required in the plan. So you have to understand that behind it there is a whole toolkit, but on a scale which is unprecedented, because in 5 years that means you have it between 10 and 15 million illegal immigrants in the US with zero background check, no tracking of where they are. Many have just vanished. And if you look at some of the videos, some of them walk in age group 18 to 25, walk in single file with military precision, with their arms swinging almost in unison because they've been trained with military precision. There are people across the border and journalists in the US who have gone across the border into Mexico and found Al-Qaeda training centers there, training the Al-Qaeda operatives and then sending them across as illegal immigrants who walk in with full mobile phones and finances and everything, sometimes with weapons. Nothing is checked. And the journalist who exposed this was arrested by FBI, and they wanted to have his videos and sources. Rather than taking action, it was suppressed by the mainstream media and by the FBI. And you have to ask yourself, what is the desperation? Who is actually controlling the US? What is the plan? And we're going to come to this in a short while. Elon Musk also has provided on the platform of Twitter the Tucker Carlson interview of Vladimir Putin. And for the first time in the Western media space, you have actually a chance to listen to Putin speaking about his position, not only on the Ukraine war, but generally on what's happening in the West, but especially on the Ukraine situation. And I would highly recommend for you to watch that. I've put that in the links for today. There are several links. The first one is Candace Owens. She's a US Congress representative. She speaks on the CIA and the place of the CIA. And the point she makes is, the CIA is no more an intelligence agency for the United States, because it's not looking at US interests. It's looking at cabal interests on a globalist agenda. It is using the media that it controls against the US citizens, and to bully not only US citizens but US politicians to take positions which are against US interests. So CIA has ceased to be a US intelligence agency. It is a cabal agency, and that's a very important point that she makes. And there's a second link I've put, which is of a CIA agent speaking of how they would control the media. Now this goes back to the time when US was still in Vietnam, and he's speaking of what they did then. He's obviously survived, but if somebody today spoke up, they would not survive because circumstances have changed, and that's way back. They don't care too much. The third link I've put is the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. I would highly recommend for two reasons. One, you understand the other side's viewpoint. And it's not important whether you agree or not, but you get the viewpoint. But second, you get a completely different view of who is this man called Putin. Because if you had read the media as it is presented to you, you would have thought this man is a demon. I'm surprised when I go or look at the media sources in the West and how they present Modi. Oh, you'd have thought this man is a Muslim hater and a demon. Except that you're seeing him completely the opposite from within India. And that's what makes me wonder, what about those other world figures that are being presented to me, that are being demonized? What are they truly like? And if I quote from RussianRT.com, it'll say, that's propaganda. But meet the man directly and see what he has to say and how he says it and how he responds to the question. And Tucker Carlson is not at all supportive. He questions him, challenges him, and sometimes quite forcibly, and counters him. And you see how he responds to that. And that's when you get a sense of who the man is. And so I won't say more, but I'll just leave it for you to see that. There's also a link which has the full transcript. I'll try to put it, I have not put it here, but I'll try to put that perhaps by tomorrow if you want to read. But it's a different thing when you listen. And then, very important, there's one link which is of Cabal agent working in Ladakh. And that's a link again on Twitter, which somebody called Bhikkhu Mhatre, he's a commentator on Twitter who does a lot of very good analysis. It's worth following him and seeing the kind of material he has put up. There's an analysis of one of these persons who's working in Ladakh to provoke demonstrations which eventually will become riots. It's the same toolkit mechanism. But look at the person, look at his background, and see how he's been awarded, and what is the award representing, and who's actually funding the award, and what is the agenda behind. Finally, the link number 4, which is of the FBI warning about serious terrorist attacks, and I'm going to come to that shortly. So all this is to give you an idea of how desperate they are to stop Elon Musk. Also because Twitter as a platform has suddenly made possible for people to have actual open discussion, question even the current media narratives of the cabal. Now we come to the bigger picture. Because if this is so critical, the US election, India election is not as critical, it's second most critical, let's say. But if this is so critical, and if for whatever reason the cabal is unable to counter by the means which they have used before, there is still a backup plan. And this plan has been spoken about very openly by the World Economic Forum, which, as you know, is the cabal's economic agency. It was the World Economic Forum that 2 months before COVID hit the world as an international, as they called it, pandemic, actually did a dry run. They had a meeting in which they said, if there is an international pandemic using this kind of a virus, and it's the same category of virus, what would be the appropriate response? And they went through what would be like a dry run and a practice run. Who would do what would be the things you have to do. This was in October. And then November, as you know, the leak started in China. December, January, it spread. And at that point, when Trump was trying to stop flights from China, all of his opposition was actually saying what a xenophobe he is. He hates foreigners. And actually said, go and embrace all the Chinese people in the US and in Europe. And interestingly, in Italy, there was the same movement, embrace the Chinese people. And there's a hub where the Chinese people control the textiles industry. That's where COVID hit the largest numbers and the largest numbers of infections and deaths. And similarly in the US. But at the time when the first infection officially entered the US is when they started the proceedings in the United States to impeach Trump. And once the proceeding starts, nothing can happen other than that. So straight away, I don't remember, 10 days or so, they lost, during which the whole thing was spreading, and there was no possibility to stop the flights until after. And by then it had sufficiently entrenched itself in the US. Then, when actually the COVID hit, the same people who were criticizing him for being xenophobe turned against him and said he didn't do enough because he didn't stop the flights from coming in and otherwise. So I'm just showing you how the media played. And if you were sufficiently unaware and did not remember, you would have believed each time Trump was wrong and again Trump was wrong. It can't be both times he was wrong. One of them had to be right. And yet that's how the media works, and successfully, because we don't think and we don't look back at the past data. As they say in the media industry, the public has a very short memory. All you need is one dramatic crisis and they forget the previous one, and they're busy running after this current one. But coming back to World Economic Forum, because you have to understand it's the voice of the cabal for its globalist and economic policies. They've been speaking openly for a while now of what they call the Great Reset. And particularly post-COVID pandemic, they spoke of the Great Reset and the opportunity that the COVID pandemic provided. And they said it's a very narrow window of opportunity, their spokesman said, in which we can reset the whole world and the global economy and bring it along the lines of what they want as the globalist state, one world government. They were able to push through substantially for a while, but eventually there was pushback and they had to relent. But there are systems set in place. And these systems are now being activated and even being amplified. And I'm going to look at some of these today as we discuss, because all of these might get activated in the next few months or this 1 year. Understand, it's not intended to be a prophetic discussion. It's only looking at trends. Any of these trends may be activated or a combination of them, or they may all fail because from the other side there might be a pushback which is more effective. More likely there will be a very tight and difficult struggle, out of which the outcome is uncertain for both sides. And that's why this period is so important. Now, what is this Great Reset? The idea here is, and according to World Economic Forum, the economy itself will be reset in such a way that suddenly nobody will have money and nobody will need money. It will be the ideal communist system. You will own nothing. This is an actual quote. You will own nothing and you will be happy. Meaning what? The state will provide food, it will provide shelter, it will provide job. You will own nothing, but you will be happy because we will give you everything that you need: food, shelter, job. Isn't that the ideal of communism? Isn't that what they tried in the Soviet Union and in China, etc., until eventually the communist framework collapsed? But this is a group that wants to impose that, and of course once you have that, it's basically you're in a jail, which is what you saw in China, even now to a great extent, and in the Soviet Union of that time, and other places where this has been put into effect. Yes, communism has a truth, we know that. I won't go into that discussion. Sri Aurobindo makes the point of the principle of equality and the capitalism representing the principle of liberty, except both of them compromise the other principle unless there is a fraternity. But where is this? Ideally should be a spiritual fraternity. Where is that? When the agenda of the cabal is to divide people and prevent such a fraternity. So we are back to this point where if the Great Reset is successfully implemented by the WEF, the world would be pushed to a communist state. Now this was their original plan with the COVID, and Trump destroyed it for them, cut it short by introducing the vaccines prematurely. And even though the vaccines were harmful, he made it optional. But using that as a vehicle, the plan was shorted. Otherwise, that lockdown was intended to be extended for several years until a vaccine is developed, which takes 5 years normally. And then they would have said, well, it's not happening, the vaccine is not possible, as in fact we find the vaccine is quite ineffective, although they promised us it is effective. If you see again the data, they said first 100% effective, then they said 95%, then 90%, then 80%, then 70%. And eventually today they say, yes, it has only reduced a few deaths, and that's it. And this is all again actual statements coming from the companies which produce the vaccines. But what is interesting is, if that be the case, that a vaccine cannot be made for this kind of a virus with any long-term value, then what happens next? You have to stay in lockdown. And that was the intent. And the result of the lockdown is you have no money, you have no earning, and you would have implemented the Great Reset then. That was the original plan of the cabal. That failed for the reasons we have discussed before. So what happens now? The agenda is still on, they're still speaking about it, but observe what they're currently doing. And this is where you get a sense of what is imminent. And I've described it as desperate measures from the cabal. You see, in the intelligence industry, there's a phrase used called chatter. So you're monitoring the other countries or the terrorist cells. Let's say, for example, India monitors the training camps across the border in Pakistan, where they train terrorists and then send them across into India in Kashmir or otherwise. You monitor the communications. Now, some of these are coded, some are not. The critical things are all coded. But what you do notice is before the event, there's a lot of coordination taking place. The number of coded communications starts rising. So the vocabulary used in the intelligence agencies is increasing chatter. Now, secretly, probably this side has learned to decode some of the coded communications, and they will not tell you they have. But when they have, they can also break into the chatter and they can see the number of communications. Even when it's coded electronically, the speeches remains coded. They will speak of, have you sent the goods? Have the apples come? Where are the oranges? By which they mean specific weapons, etc. So you hear of apples and oranges, but you know what it means. You know it means something. So you know that there is an imminent attack planned for. So when chatter goes up, you know an attack is imminent. Depending on how and where, you can even make an overall guess which direction and perhaps even of timing. This is very important. I'll come back to this, but we can do an equivalent. We as civilians can do an equivalent for cabal chatter. If you consider that 80 to 90% of the global media is controlled and centrally controlled, observe when keywords suddenly pop up across the media, across countries and across platforms, suddenly, spontaneously. And Google has a particular way on their search engine that you can search for the who's looking for keywords, and you get a graph of how certain keywords have been activated, either in the texts, in the media or in searches. So this is us now observing the cabal using intelligence agency techniques, watching for chatter. Now when you see certain things, suddenly WF is speaking of Great Reset, everyone's talking of Great Reset, and one of the keywords you will find, Build Back Better, BBB. It's intended to have this mantric character. Suddenly all the European heads of state are saying build back better, which means what? Destroy first, then build back better. But build back better than what? In what framework? Well, that's the Great Reset. So, looking at the chatter, we find one thing very suddenly appearing in the last 2 months, and it is this term Black Swan event. I'm going to point to this because it's a warning of what's going to happen very likely. Black Swan event is used in the economic framework, where a black swan event is something impossible, totally unexpected, you could never have foreseen, almost impossible. That suddenly happens, and because of that, the whole economy changes. 9/11 as an attack which sunk the economy was a black swan event. Technically, a terrorist attack would be a black swan event, but unforeseen terrorist attack. Suddenly, all across the media and cabal-controlled mainstream media, you have this talk about a black swan event, or even an explanation of what a black swan event means. So they are educating you for a vocabulary they will use when it happens and saying, oh, it's a black swan event. And by then you've been programmed enough to say, ah yes, I know what a black swan event is. And of course, because you've been prepared over a few months of the kinds of black swan events, when they happen you say, ah yes, of course it was expected and I knew it was expected. No, you didn't. You were told to expect it. It had no other reason to be other than that. So, first of all, there's this trigger word black swan event introduced in media chatter, which is a warning that they're planning a black swan event. And then look at the chatter, what it points to as black swan events. And I'm going to list a whole lot of them. It doesn't mean they'll all happen. Maybe some will happen. Maybe these are all things the cabal is preparing for or creating fear about. Or maybe they will trigger all one after another. I don't know. And maybe I'm completely wrong. But I'm just describing the chatter and from an analyst perspective giving you the data. Maybe it will be useful, maybe not, doesn't matter. But it's useful to understand the cabal mindset and potential strategies they may use. So let's look at some of them. One of the chatter messages that's being put out very strongly is that a computer virus would be so destructive that you'd have to shut down the internet to protect your computers and your data from the virus. Or a hacking attack could be so destructive that to prevent the hacking attack, you would have to shut down the internet. And you're being told this again and again through various sources. And it's being repeated. So that to me is a sign that something is being prepared for. Yes, I have a comment from somebody, Nil, who's very upset about this, saying we want evidence. No, I'm not going to give you evidence. Do your own research. This is stuff I've been observing, and I'm not here to prove anything to you. I'm just providing data I have seen. Maybe it's true, as I said. Maybe I'm wrong, doesn't matter. But if you understand the cabal mindset, you will understand how this works. So look at all the news items pushing for internet hacking and attack on infrastructure. Look at successful attacks on infrastructure, which is also very unusual. So you find in the US, for example, the electrical grid, water supply systems have all been exposed to the internet, and you wouldn't understand why. It's actually an open target for hacking attacks. Normally, your critical infrastructure, you do everything possible to protect it. And one of the things you do is you do not provide for openness to internet because it could be hacked. So you don't put, for example, your electricity for hacking. In Pondicherry, for example, about 2 years back, and they used COVID as the excuse for that, as a pilot project, they put these internet-controlled electricity meters in every house. So once it happened that the electricity bill did not come, so it was not paid, 7 days passed and suddenly we had a power cut. I went and saw everywhere else there's power, just in our house it's cut. So I went to the office and I said, there's a power cut. He looked at his paper. Oh yes, you have not paid your bill. Wow, no second attempt. The bill did not come for whatever reason. Maybe it was misplaced, maybe, I don't know, maybe we didn't see. But because it was not paid, they just cut the power. How? Remotely. And the man laughed and said, yeah, if you don't pay within 7 days, we just cut the power. We don't give you a second chance. We don't give you a warning. We don't give you a third warning. We just cut the power. How? Well, it's automatic. The computer does it. It's programmed for that. Can you imagine how serious this is? Because all of these meters are made in China by the same company. And I saw how they were programming it to cut the power. And then to reset the meter, the man had to come, connect a wire, and reset it. You could not reset remotely. You see how dangerous this is? If you can control remotely to disactivate, you should be able to also activate. No. For resetting, someone has to come to your house to do it. Now imagine a hacker getting the key codes by which they switched off the meter. In one go, the entire Pondicherry space could be shut down. Just like that. And then you would have one man or maybe 2 or 3 people running around house to house to reset the meters. And if the hacking attack does not stop, it will keep resetting, switching off. You reset, switch off, reset, switch off. What do? It is the most silly, crazy thing they could have done. The thing which should have been relevant was to read the meter from a distance electronically. Agreed. But to shut it down electronically was the most crazy thing. And to make the restarting to be manual was the most crazy thing. But you have to understand this is not done by chance. It's obvious to someone like me that this is a silly thing. It's dangerous. The logic I'm offering you is so obvious. So why would you do that? Unless behind that there's an agenda which is being built up. And Pondicherry was supposed to be a pilot project, which means eventually this will be done everywhere. I give an example of this electricity grid, similarly water, nuclear power stations, and the shutdown of the internet because of virus. This is one side of the chatter. The second chatter happening is solar flares. We're being told a solar flare hitting the earth would shut down satellites, shut down the internet, shut down radio communication. Recently, as it happened a week back, Australia, radio communication was shut down because of a solar flare. And we have been told repeatedly that a big one can come and hit any time. So again, to me, that's an interesting chatter. Third chatter is about food. Insufficient food. In the US, remarkably, more than 25 major food producers have had big fires where the entire production factory has been burned down. I've mentioned this before, but again, look at the data. It's unusual. It has never happened within 2 years. And the number, what I'm speaking of, is already 6 months old. Many more subsequently, I've seen fires taking place in various kinds of food production factories. And often you're getting this news about shortages of various foods, shortages of various kinds of electronics, prices of certain kinds of electronics going up because of shortage of chips, which are being produced in Taiwan and nowhere else. Isn't that strange? So this is another example of some kind of a chatter. What you do notice is policies are being set which are anti-farmer to prevent farmers from being profitable. This is happening in France, it's happening in Canada, in the United States, in Germany. And what is not told to you by the mainstream media is right now there are major demonstrations taking place by farmers in France, in Germany, in Canada. It happened earlier, just after COVID, in other parts of the northern countries in Europe. And all of them because of state-imposed policies which are harmful to the farmers' profitability. If those policies continue, the farmers would have to shut down their farms, creating an artificial shortage. Now, why would you do that deliberately? For no reason, everything was fine. Why do you squeeze the farmer right now? And all simultaneously together. And to me, that's a sign of black swan event intended. And all it would need, for example, is an internet shutdown and combined with the food being just on the brink of supply, and you would have a crisis and perhaps riots and civil war. Another messaging coming from the World Economic Forum is pushing for what they call disease X. You would have seen headlines everywhere in all platforms, and it keeps popping up, vanishing, just enough that it stays in your consciousness. They speak of it as disease X, and the headlines will go things like, what is disease X? Disease X is imminent. We have to prepare for disease X. World Economic Forum they speak of, and then there is the other entity which is handling the world affairs in health, World Health, WHO, World Health Organization, is speaking of countries that need to prepare for disease X. So to educate you for the event, they tell you what is disease X, why it's dangerous. And what do they say? There is a disease, we don't know what, we don't know how, we don't know when, but we know that it is 10 times more dangerous than the COVID of last time. How? You see how ridiculous the whole thing is. It's 10 times more dangerous, not 9 times, not 8 times, not 5 times, not 2 times, 10 times. How do you know? No reason. But we know that it will be 10 times dangerous. When will it come? We don't know. What is it? We don't know. You see how ridiculous it is. And yet this fear mongering is being pushed that next time it's going to be 10 times worse than COVID. Therefore, whatever we did with COVID is absolutely essential to be in place. So that the moment the World Health Organization states, we have found disease X, the entire world can go into lockdown to protect itself from the imminent infection of disease X before it can spread. You see the rationale for this. And they are demanding, World Health Organization, that every country get into an agreement where when World Health Organization says, now you have to shut down, you will shut down. Effectively handing over your independence to this organization to a point where they don't even have to prove it to you. They just have to say, we have detected disease X, please shut down, and you will be forced to shut down by agreement. This is what they're asking for. And if I remember right, the whole thing is centered around a few months down, I think by June, that this is going to come into effect or something like that. If you think about it, this is a step towards the one world government based on fear mongering. And they're using COVID, which they could not complete with the global reset agenda, as a fear for a reference for disease X, which is somehow 10 times more dangerous, more destructive. 10 times more people will die, etc. So this is another of the black swan events that we are being prepared for. Simultaneously, we are being told that there are imminent terrorist attacks, imminent wars. So in the Middle East, somehow spreading out from the conflict within Israel with Hamas, Iran is being targeted and Yemen is being targeted by the US. And for what? Think about it. Yemen Houthis attacked certain ships. Why? Well, it's because we are backing Hamas. No, that's not the reason. Because they were activated to this mission. It's not logical. You're attacking ships which have nothing to do with Israel. You just want to shut down somehow the whole passage through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So all the big ships are going around Cape of Good Hope. Suddenly everything is delayed, everything is more expensive, etc. And of course you're pushing through inflation like crazy. But the fear, uncertainty, and as a result now the US has to necessarily attack, but they also want to attack Iran. There's a threatening cycle happening. China will take its sides and so on. Imminent idea of war in the Middle East once again. And what is more interesting is China's invasion in Taiwan, which is like held as a potential. If the US gets embroiled in war in the Middle East, they would not have the necessary troops, resources, platforms to be able to protect Taiwan. And China could step in. Again, that's being told to you. It's not something I'm making up. It's out there in the media being repeated, hammered away. And of course, the Ukraine war itself is being escalated step by step. So what is all this pointing to? And they're telling you that the US does not have resources to handle 3 wars at the same time. What they're not telling you is what is important. And that's what I'm going to point to now. Antifa riots in the US, I've spoken about before. Black Lives Matter riots in the US, I've spoken about before. One of the characteristics of these was people went dressed in black. So you never knew who they were. And I've seen videos, I've saved them, which showed Black Lives Matter, someone painting BLM. They came back from that. Half the mask was out or some part of it. Suppose it was a white person. Strange. It's not a black person pushing for Black Lives Matter in a black community or space. It is a white person doing that in a black community. Why would you do that? Unless the goal was to create this fear or trigger a group. And so you have people who have been set up for the purpose of activating using the toolkit methods that we have discussed, for purpose of activating groups to go into riot mode. And the thing not spoken about at all in the US, and this is the most serious, which is what we earlier touched upon, the number of illegal immigrants coming in, which are of military age, which have military training, some of which are known to have trained, and many are coming from countries which hate the United States. The statements coming from the border police is that, and they name the countries from which they're coming, the 73 countries from which people have come. Many of them are criminals coming from these countries, many of them are terrorists. Why are they suddenly walking across and being given shelter, welcomed with open arms, provided all kinds of facilities, and then suddenly mysteriously disappearing all over? Keep in mind, in 5 years, the approach numbers would be anything 10 million to 15 million. Iran, for example, under attack from the US. What would be the rational thing for it to do? Rather than fighting back in the US, on the waters across Iran, where they know they will lose because US has overwhelming power, what would they do? The right thing would be, if they wanted to really bring down the US, well, send a few of your operatives, and you don't need more than 30 or 40 to bring the US to its knees. How? One strategic grenade thrown at an electricity transformer. You see, these are transformers built sometimes 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. A major transformer, a major distribution part of the grid. Throw one grenade, a transformer bursts. The entire grid in that area shuts down with a chain reaction. Let's assume other grids still isolate themselves. If the transformer is destroyed, and this is something which has no moving parts, the US does not have the capability to build these transformers today. And this is coming from reports from the US government. In order to build those transformers and replace that, internal capacity of the US is it would take 1 year or 2 years. Well, they would have to buy the transformers from China. Depending on whether China at that point has invaded Taiwan, it may or may not offer you the transformers. If it did, and if you're 30 or 40 people now destroyed 200 or 300 transformers, perhaps China doesn't have the capability to provide you all the transformers rapidly enough. You see what I'm pointing to? The vulnerability within the US, and considering that these are military trained people, at least a significant portion, even if it's 1% out of 10 million, that's a very large number walking in. To do what? And if they're trained to do what? They're sleeper cells waiting to be activated. By whom? It does not even matter today, because it could be the cabal interests which use this as a black swan event, blaming anybody else. It doesn't even have to be an Iran operative. It needs only to be a cabal operative that the media will say is Iran. That's all you need. It'll be a false flag event. And the US overnight would be brought to its knees. Electricity cut in a large city where you cannot restore it within 2 or 3 days means all the water pumps fail. Water supply from the tanks stops. You don't have water to shower, but more seriously, you don't have water to drink. What happens next? Think about the implications. You don't have gas pumps which can pump gas to your car for you to go somewhere else. And if you go somewhere else, where will you live? And this is not my thinking. These are from actual reports from the United States, from their own security, which are warning you of these dangers. And the government does nothing to take steps to prevent this. That tells you something serious is afoot. Now I'm coming to actual facts of statements by the government representatives. And I've put a link there, which is a link where this sheriff of one of the cities in the US speaks of a meeting that they had with the FBI head, Christopher Wray, where the FBI head tells them, the sheriffs of the United States, that we already have more intelligence chatter and red flags than before 9/11 attack of an imminent terrorist attack in the United States. Far more than what was seen before 9/11. And so he's warning, there might be anything which could happen anywhere and maybe all over, we don't know. But what's the government doing about it to preempt it? Nothing. And when they do nothing in the face of this kind of information, you know that they want to allow the black swan event to happen for whatever reasons, as you've seen, and it may have to do with elections or whatever, or simply the Great Reset. So we have a precedent of how we were lied to during COVID in so many ways. First, they told you that it is non-infectious, do not worry. Then they suddenly said it's infectious, lockdown. And then they told you had to put masks because you don't know if you're infected or not. And even though the masks were not helpful, all the evidence of medical evidence was it is ineffective. It is in fact harmful. The masks will cause more sickness because it's preventing proper drying and allowing fungus to grow in the mask, in the nose. Despite the medical evidence, these were the policies. Irrational, scientifically wrong, being instituted across the world. You were asked to stay home indoors when actually being exposed to the sun would build immunity. And so on. So they lied to you royally, all the way down from the highest structures, World Health Organization, to your governments, through the media, and on the basis of fear. They gave you a vaccination where they lied to you of the efficacy and the utility of the vaccine. First, they promised you that if you had that, you would never get sick. Then they said, no, but you can get sick, but you will not die. Oh no, you may die, but you will not die in the same numbers as those who were unvaccinated. And now they say if you were vaccinated, then your immunity is actually lower and you need to do something else to strengthen your immunity by taking another vax, booster, etc. They lied to you all through. Not once did the media or these globalist institutions tell you the truth. And the truth was spoken by the people, by the doctors, by the specialists of those fields, including the man who actually invented the method by which you were detecting the COVID. And he said that this is not effective because it will give you false positives. He was suppressed from Twitter, removed from Twitter. And the medical experts globally of pandemics, the world authorities on pandemics saying this is not a pandemic, this does not follow the pandemic, or do not follow these protocols, that's not suitable for a pandemic, all cancelled on Twitter. So you have already a good precedent for this, except today Twitter is free, but all other media is still controlled. So I'm pointing to a situation which is extremely dangerous, and the World Economic Forum as spokespersons for the cabal is telling you of an imminent black swan event. The chatter in the media is showing you various kinds of potential black swan events. Will it happen? I don't know. And I'm not going to offer any predictions. What I'm showing you is there's an interesting pattern. Hopefully, it will all be countered by other powers which are against. But more likely, some of these will get activated. And that's why this 1 year is going to be important. But if we as people can be conscious and see through the game, we can begin to make a difference. So, not only actively in our spaces speak about it, but also on a deeper level in consciousness terms, if we are awake and look through, it will have a ripple effect on others like us who perhaps may also begin to look through. There's one more thing which I want to add about the activation of influences, which is a little odd, it's strange, but you will see recently there was a lot of media exposure given to some singer called Taylor Swift. If you actually listen to her singing, she sings out of tune. Terrible. If you listen to her wordings, they are all about being sad, being disappointed, and being okay with being unhappy, disappointed, or sad, or whatever. Being okay with it. And that's the messaging that's happening. She's being promoted as one of the greatest in the media circles. And one of the biggest events in the US media is this Super Bowl event where she's being promoted and all kinds of things. I don't want to go into detail. But if you see all her performances, they are all involving satanic symbolism, etc. But what is interesting, and I came across this recently, there were people who had been to her performances and came back and said they don't remember what they saw or what they heard. The only thing they had was evidence they had paid for the ticket, they had the ticket in hand, but they couldn't remember what happened during the performance. It was as if they were in a state of hypnosis. This is not by chance. There is actually an active influence used through such means to influence people through hypnosis. And I remember there was this one performance put up by Madonna, and it was one of these big events. Perhaps it was one of these Super Bowl or one such event, in one of the biggest in the US. And I remember because at that time I was clued in with some of these people who were doing this analysis. And what she started was, she comes on stage and she's singing a messaging which is going subliminally into you with a lot of satanic symbolism. And then as she walks off after the performance, as she's about to leave the stage, she stops, turns around and says, "Wake up," and then goes out. When you analyze all the things, it was actually a series of repetitive words to put you in a state of hypnosis, program you for a certain post-hypnotic suggestion, and ending with the command, "Wake up." This is not by chance. I know enough because I've studied that neuro-linguistic programming and hypnosis long ago to understand how those things worked, because I can see those patterns. And it's all being used through these singers. And this Taylor Swift is one such, and there are many others. But when the media is promoting a personality like this, who doesn't even sing well, even her dancing is very crude and superficial, just sexual gyrations and movements. Why is she being promoted in this way? Why is the messaging coming out in this way? And yes, you get a picture of what it's being used for. So this is just to tell you that the cabal has activated all of its means to push through a certain agenda. The agenda is quite large. In the original framework of the declared WAF agenda, timing wise, the intention was by 2025, that is next year, they wanted the entire world in the Great Reset. That means you should be actually in an economic collapse, and they would take a few years. By 2030, you would own nothing and be happy. That was their timeline. So some of it has been disrupted by many of these disruptors, but as a result, they are taking desperate measures, which is the theme, the title I've given for today's discussion. And I think that's about all I will say as far as the negatives are concerned. Be aware, observe, and educate yourself. And as I said, everything I've stated, apart from the content which is opinion, the facts I've all validated. I have all the links. I don't have the time to put it together, but do your searches, find them out. And one of the best sources which I've highly recommended earlier was this site called The Gateway Pundit. You'll find a lot of material, primarily US based, but still it is very useful. And on Twitter today, statements of Elon Musk, as well as there are many others doing a lot of analysis. Some of the links I've given you would be a good starting point. One thing you could do, you click follow on some of these links who are giving you useful information. Look at their videos and scroll to the next video. And the Twitter algorithm combines videos of the same category, the same type. And then educate yourself. See where it goes. So I think this is as far as I'm going to go with this part of the content. Next time I hope to have only a positive messaging for a potential future that is waiting for us. So Patel is asking about the link to the Russian president's point of view. It's already there. It's in the description of this video. So all these links are put in under the title of today's video. You will find description where the title of the video is there, and then there's ... more. Click on the more and it opens out. There you'll find a list of links. Sometimes you would have to click more once again if it's on the mobile phone. You have to click more twice, then it shows you a list of the links, but they're already there. They've already been put up. I will possibly add one more, which will be the link for the transcript of the video, but still I think it's worth it for you to look at the actual person, the personality of that man. As I said, you don't like him, no problem. Look at the data and then see, at least understand the other viewpoint. But more important, I'm not even concerned about Zelensky or Putin or Biden or these frontal individuals. Look at the larger movement and the cabal moves and the chatter that's coming up in the media and where it's pointing to in their declared goals for the great reset of the world. And so far they have been pretty much on track, with only a disruption because of these major disruptors delaying. So Orgon is asking, is there any place safer to live in the future? Very practically, if your electricity goes, what do you need? Food and water. If you're living in a farm where you have your own open well from which you can get water out, you don't need electricity, you grow your own food, you're fine. Can you do that? In principle. But if you're living in cities, it's not going to be easy if that happens. But my hope is, and I genuinely hope that the pushback from the positive forces will prevent this kind of a collapse, because they know the game, they're prepared for it, and there will be things put in place to ensure this does not happen. But because it's a battle, there will be places where there might be collapses, local short-term collapses, and perhaps we will be receiving the necessary support before things can get too bad, and that would be for us the wake-up call. Finally, all rests on our consciousness collectively, and the change we will bring about collectively will start with us individually. So all of this series or this discussion on current affairs is coming back to this message. We need to grow up, get free from this power that the hypnotic media and the cabal has built over time. Cut through it, break free. Look through for what things actually are. Do your own study, do your own research, draw your own conclusion, think for yourself, do not be blind sheep. And then large part of large part of humanity also will perhaps grow and awaken, perhaps. Let's see how that works. So we can hope for the best. But Sri Aurobindo actually states this in The Ideal of Human Unity, that when this attempt is made by the cabal, he doesn't use that word, but the one world government, he says sometimes there will be steps where they would succeed, and then there would be a pushback. And the hope, he says, the hope is that those steps where they succeed would be enough as a means for humanity to wake up and ensure that there is a pushback. I'm saying it in my own words, you can read for his language, but this is the idea. The COVID lockdown globally was one such. The first time it happened, we were naive, we did not know, we accepted, and we allowed ourselves to be bullied to a point. But if now we allow the same thing to be repeated, then we would be the fools. So we must ensure that the lessons learnt, and that's why I'm giving you a picture of all the other frameworks indicated by the chatter. This lesson learnt, we will not allow that to happen. Whatever the other variations or forms in which a lockdown or a global reset might be imposed on us. So let's take a moment to concentrate on the need for humanity to wake up, and for us then spiritually also the need for us to grow. And if we can build sufficiently an awakening in the collective, this phase of the struggle between the light and dark may be shortened, and cabal interests may be overthrown, replaced as quickly as possible, within a few years perhaps. And my hope is in the next 5 years, things will turn radically, and in what way it may happen, at least the direction I will indicate in what we discuss next time, and that will be a message of hope, I'm sure. May the knowledge that Sri Aurobindo has given us help us to understand and cut through the appearances and work towards the realization of a higher divine truth and a divine life on earth. May the action of the Divine Mother lift all, awaken all, and counter the forces of darkness by the power of force, spiritual force and light, and the consciousness of Durga and Mahakali working in us and in the world's circumstances, because it's a battle. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.